these systems or viewpoints is what we call existentialism. Now, it's a very difficult task to try to cover the philosophy of existentialism in 30 minutes, so we're going to have to move quickly and skate lightly over the surface of it. But one of the things that we need to be aware of with respect to existentialism is that normally, when a philosophical perspective is devised by some profound scholar who's sitting in an academic university somewhere and writes in a very technical vein, normally it takes decades and decades for that theoretical thought to trickle down to the level of the grassroots of the culture where people begin to feel and to see the impact of that new train of thought. But there, infrequently, but occasionally in the history of Western civilization, there will be a new philosophical movement that will bridge that gap very quickly and make its impact felt in a very rapid way. And one of the most rapid impacts of a philosophical movement in history is that which has come about through the philosophy known as existentialism. In fact, I doubt if there's any philosophical system that has had as much impact on American culture in the 20th century as has this school of thought. And I'm going to say that you encounter the influence of existentialism every single day of your life, and in virtually every sphere of the culture that you bump up against. Now, very few people can define it and understand the theory of it, but they are living in it every day. Now, some of the reasons why existentialism has moved so rapidly from the theoretical to the grassroots of the culture is, for several reasons. First of all, because the chief advocates of existentialism have not only been brilliant technical philosophers, but we have seen some extraordinarily gifted men who had the ability not only to do the technical work, but also to translate their ideas in a more popular medium. I think of Jean-Paul Sartre, who on the one hand could produce a very thick volume of weighty philosophy called Being and Nothingness, and yet take those heavy ideas and disperse them in the culture because he was also a playwright and a novelist. Albert Camus wrote novels to express his own philosophical insight. Soren Kierkegaard writes with the lyrical style of the poet. Friedrich Nietzsche was also a great writer and had an unusual capacity to communicate his ideas. Again, another reason why existentialism has made its impact felt is that because the philosophy itself, by definition, I've said 2 or 3 times already, I've called existentialism a system of thought because I'm so accustomed to calling philosophies systems. But one of the things about existentialism is that it is allergic to systems. It's an anti-system, and it thrives not so much on a interconnected, coherent, well-related worldview, but more it builds upon individual flashes of insight, brilliant vignettes drawn from the close regions of daily life. But I think most importantly, existentialism has had such an impact because it addresses itself not so much to abstract questions of metaphysics or epistemology or other of the traditional concerns of the philosopher, but it speaks directly to what I would call the human predicament. Its accent, as the name implies, is on human existence. Not on metaphysics, see, or not on abstract theories of knowledge, but on real, passionate life. And that's where we live. And here we have a philosophy that touches us exactly where we live. Again, existentialism was not born in the 20th century. I've seen volumes that say from Augustine to Sartre or to Camus and tracing the roots of existentialism back to St. Augustine. Others have traced it even earlier to Heraclitus, the pre-Socratic Greek philosopher. Some see Shakespeare as the real modern innovator of existentialism. But as a formal movement, it really began in the 19th century with two very, very important thinkers. One being Christian in his disposition, and the other one being atheistic in his disposition. And of course, for the purposes of this survey of secularism and our culture, we'll concern ourselves primarily with the atheistic variety of existentialism rather than the theistic movement that was championed by Kierkegaard, who I'm sure you've heard about. But Friedrich Nietzsche was very important in the 19th century, and the giants of the 20th century would include men like Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Martin Heidegger, the German, and a host of lesser luminaries. But it really made its impact felt in America after World War II. Sartre and Camus were very much involved in the Great War in Europe, working with the underground. And when it was exposed of the fiendish atrocities that were associated with the Holocaust in Western Europe, a whole sense and mood of despair enveloped the continent. And the philosophers looked at the atrocities of Buchenwald and of Auschwitz and others and said, this is what man is capable of doing. And so the certain spirit of optimism that had so characterized the 19th century gave way to this atmosphere of gloom. And again, Jean-Paul Sartre's plays had such a lot to do with communicating the motif and the moods of despair. One little book that he wrote, he titled simply Nausea, which was in a sense his bottom line evaluation of modern man. He came to the conclusion that man in the final analysis is a useless passion. That's really a philosophy of despair. Well, it made its way largely through the artist colonies across the Atlantic and took up residence in the United States. Do you remember where? Greenwich Village, with the beatnik movement and the so-called Beat Generation. And the Beat Generation communicated some of the basic ideas of the movement through their art. And so modern art has
What happened?
Shut up.
Completely? So you're not on?
I see Dennis.
Okay, so then
Just hold on. It stopped for a reason. Oh. All right, I'll try to catch this up.
as we continue our series on do with communicating the motif and the moods of despair. One little book that he wrote, he titled simply Nausea, which was in a sense his bottom line evaluation of modern man. He came to the conclusion that man in the final analysis is a useless passion. That's really a philosophy of despair. Well, it made its way largely through the artist colonies across the Atlantic and took up residence in the United States. Do you remember where? Greenwich Village, with the beatnik movement, the so-called Beat Generation. And the Beat Generation communicated some of the basic ideas of the movement through their art. And so modern art has been a major vehicle to communicate the ideas of existentialism, as well as the film industry. Again, European films, Ingmar Bergman's films. You've heard of Ingmar Bergman and the motifs that are found in his films. In this country, I can never say his name, Antonioni's films and Fellini's films have also communicated some of the motifs of existentialism. And the phenomenon that we saw in the 60s on Broadway called the theater of the absurd. Do you remember that? With Beckett and Edward Albee and others. Beckett's play Waiting for Godot. Who is Godot? God. The idea is that modern man lives in the absence of God. And he's waiting for, hoping that somehow God will show up. And the theater of the absurd went to such extremes that some of the last productions, the actors would come out on the stage and they would just stand in the middle of the stage and they would go like this. Now what were they saying? They were saying that man has reached the point of irrationality to such a degree that even human speech is no longer intelligible. There is no meaning to life, and since meaning traditionally is communicated how? By words or by pictures that are easy to understand. The new message was, life is meaningless. It's not a symphony, it's a cacophony. There is nothing that brings the universe together in a coherent fashion. It is a movement away from rationality toward irrationality. Religious movements sprung up embracing existential principles such as Zen Buddhism, which was really the first penetration in Western culture from the Oriental religions. Not in pure Buddhism, but in an existential variety of Buddhism known as Zen Buddhism. All right, well, what are some of the ideas that we're speaking of here? Well, in the traditional slogan for existentialism comes from the French thinker Jean-Paul Sartre, and it reads simply, existence precedes essence. There's a sense in which that little formula captures the philosophy of existentialism in a nutshell. Existence precedes essence. Now, I can see by the looks in your eyes that you are saying, what in the world is this man talking about? What do you mean, existence precedes essence? Well, it means a lot. But traditionally, the quest in philosophy was the quest for universals, the quest for the whole picture, the quest for the unification of all of the details and particulars of our daily lives. And so we remember Pope's statement, the proper study of mankind is what? Man. Now, the only difference between Pope and Sartre would be here. Pope would say the proper study of mankind is man. Sartre would say the proper study of mankind is men. He's not concerned with the essence of humanity or the essence of truth or the essence of value, but rather he starts with the individual, with the particular. That philosophical thinking doesn't begin up in the clouds someplace, but it starts where you are, in your isolation, in your individual existence. Any conclusions that you draw about the essence of things must come out of your own individual existence. The individual is what counts, rather than the group. Now, I'd like to read a statement from William Barrett's very important study on existentialism. that is one of the best introductions for the layman that I know. It's not light, it's not simple, but it's also not technical, called Irrational Man, and I commend it to you. And Barrett makes this statement, and I don't like to usually read passages from books for you, but I'm going to do it in this session because I want you to listen to every word of this very brief paragraph. When mankind no longer lives spontaneously turned toward God or the supersensible world, when, to echo the words of Yeats, the ladder is gone. He's talking about not the ladder, L-A-T-T-E-R, but the ladder, the step ladder. The ladder is gone by which we would climb to a higher reality. The artist, too, must stand face to face with a flat and inexplicable world. This shows itself even in the formal structures of modern art, where the movement of the spirit is no longer vertical, but only horizontal. The climactic elements in art are in general leveled out. They are flattened. What Barrett is saying is the ladder from earth to heaven has vanished. The vertical sphere is no longer the concern of the artist. That man lives in this dimension. Does that sound familiar in terms of our discussion of secularism? And so you will see what appears to the naked eye to be very bizarre forms of modern art. Cubism, for example. Picasso's. You look at Picasso's guitars, that the shape is so funny, or a face with three noses or three eyes and all these distortions that you look at that and you say, that doesn't make sense to me. Well, the artist is saying, that's because I'm compressing life and flattening it out so that we understand that all of life has to be understood on this level, on the horizontal level. The other accent that comes across is that what we have is not an objective existence or an objective category of mankind. All we have are living, breathing, passionate, individual subjects. You are a subject, you are a subject, you are a subject. Kierkegaard said it this way, truth is subjectivity. And so the accent now becomes on the personal. We live in a culture of the most intense introspection, looking into the subject as we've ever had. Self-improvement, self-help, accent on the I rather than the we. All of this revolves around this flow of the motif of subjectivism, which is vital to existentialism. But let me just write on the board now 4 or 5 of the major themes that we encounter in existentialism. Recurring motifs that appear again and again. First of all, there is the nothingness. And before I write the second one down, I'll comment on this. We find this quite early in the development of existentialism, as far back as the work of Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche, who's famous for declaring that God is dead, is known as the father of what is called nihilism. What is nihilism? What does the word nihil mean? Nothingness. Nietzsche spoke of this, that the essence or the ultimate significance of life is das Nichts, the nothingness. And so he is called the father of nihilism. Nihilism is a philosophy of despair which says there is no meaning to human existence. There are no ultimate values for life. Nietzsche said the only meaning you can discover in this world is whatever meaning you determine for yourself. But there's no transcendent meaning, only your preferences. And if you think about that long enough, you can say there is no ultimate reason for human existence. And human existence came from nothing, and it ends in nothing. So that you live out your life between those two poles of nothingness. So Nietzsche emphasized this sense of the nihil, of nothingness, and it's also picked up and employed, as I said, by 20th century existentialists. Again, Jean-Paul Sartre's largest work, a big thick volume in philosophy, was titled Being and Nothingness. Being and nothingness. There is, consequently, a strong sense of despair and dread that filters through this philosophy. In fact, the writings of the men who are the champions of existentialism are filled with these exact words: dread, despair, words like that. It's a very sober view of reality, saying if life is ultimately nothingness, how can we escape despair? It was Camus who said the only serious question left for philosophers to investigate is the question of suicide. And so you see in the film industry a real shift in the plot and the storyline. Where it used to be, you would go through the drama and the pathos of pain and even death and all of that on the screen, but you could always look forward to the happy ending. When I grew up, we went to the serials on Saturday afternoon, and there was the Lone Ranger and Gene Autry, and you could always tell who the good guy was because he wore a white hat. And he won in the end. And he was noble and virtuous, and he had certain lasting ideals. But Hollywood picks up this theme of existentialism by showing us films of despair that end in total destruction, with no hope held out. In fact, the appearance of Rocky in Hollywood drove the fans crazy because there was a certain sense in which Rocky represented a turning point in the film industry, because Rocky number one, restored the old values of the triumph of the guy who works hard and who has dreams and aspirations, and he succeeds. And in fact, this past year, the race story, what was the name of that, that won the Academy Award? Chariots of Fire. Again, traditional values win rather than the mood of despair that has characterized so much of Hollywood productions. Movies like They Shoot Horses, don't they? Huh? Where the meaninglessness of life is emphasized. But you can see that if man comes from nothing and goes to nothing, and his existence is defined by nothingness, what other possible conclusions could you come to but despair or dread? Now there's another one, and that is the word that appears frequently, coming from the German, is the word Angst. There's been a great investigation among 20th century philosophers into the human feelings of anxiety. Not the anxiety that is specified. I mean, you may have a fear of cats, or a fear of flying, or a fear of heights, or a fear of closed-in spaces. Those are traditional fears that have the specifications attached to them. But the angst of which the philosopher speaks is that undefined, that faceless, amorphous type of anxiety that sort of hangs over you and eats away at you, and you can't really put your finger on what it is that is unsettling you inside. And of course, the greatest philosopher who's dealt with this in the 20th century, I think, is Martin Heidegger. And Heidegger wrote what I think is one of the most important books in the 20th century, simply entitled Sein und Zeit, being and time. And he says this, that traditionally we thought of humans as being human beings. We use that term being to describe a life of a person. He's a human being. And being comes from the Greek verb to be. It's the participle, the ongoing verbal sense of to be. And the German word for being is sein. Well, Heidegger doesn't talk about sein. He talks about Dasein. Now, if you know your German, you know that that word prefix da means what? Does it? Presence, or it can be used here or there. Okay? And so sein is being, and this would mean being what? Being here or being there. He doesn't talk about human beings. He talks about human beings here or human beings there. Here a being, there a being, everywhere a being. But the idea that he's getting at is that every human being's life is defined by his finite boundaries, where he is. He lives his life not in the theater of eternity, but he lives it in Stallstown or in Philadelphia, or Johnstown, or Pittsburgh, where he is. And we use statements like, well, here's where it's at. Well, here's where you're at, right here. And your life and your existence is defined by where you are. Now, in the big picture, Heidegger uses another German word, and this isn't going to be a lesson in German, but he uses another word that's very, very graphic. He said, the reason why man experiences anxiety and dread and what he calls Besorgen, care or concern, is that man, his there-ness, where he lives there as a result of what Heidegger calls the experience of Geworfenheit. What does that mean, Mark?
To be thrown.
To be thrown. I'm glad I have somebody that speaks German in this audience. To be thrown. Man has been hurled into an impersonal universe where nobody is home and expected to carve out his own existence. And he again lives between the poles of nothingness. He comes from nothing and he goes, he's destined for annihilation. And man understands that intuitively. And that's eating away at you. But we're afraid to talk about it. See? Until we're jolted to face it by Jack Kerouac in his writings, or Ernest Hemingway, or whenever we see it in the film that we were uncomfortable visiting. Other themes, quickly, include the theme of freedom in an absolute sense, in the sense of autonomy. The individual is free to carve out his own destiny. He does not have to submit to any norms because there are no norms. He is really free to do his own thing. And not only is he free to do his own thing, but he's responsible to do his own thing. This is one of the motifs of Nietzsche, who condemned 19th century people for manifesting what he called a herd morality. The herd morality is the person who does what is the expected conventional thing to do because that's safe. Nietzsche called for the new kind of hero, the Superman, the conqueror, the man who would carve out for himself his own new values. He's the man who would send his ship into uncharted seas, who would build his house on the slopes of Vesuvius, said Nietzsche. A man who lived in the context of what he called dialectical courage. What's that? Dialectical courage is the same as saying contradictory courage. The supreme virtue of the existential hero for Nietzsche, for Hemingway, for these others, is he is the man who sees that life is nothing. He looks into that pit of despair, into the black abyss of the void of nothingness, and sees that life is hopeless, sees that life is meaningless. Nevertheless, he chooses not to succumb to it or surrender it by seeking the safety of the group and conventional values and conventional institutions. But he strikes out defiantly at times. As an individual, he creates his own values. He does his own thing. Okay? And we saw this sweep through the United States of America in terms of the youth revolution and revolt against authority and against traditional values and against traditional norms. No absolutes other than be yourself, do your thing. Okay? Now that takes dialectical courage, because the true existentialist says, I realize that when I jump into that pit, that black void, that abyss, that my act of defiance against it, my choosing to act courageously and resist it, is going to end in total annihilation. But I do it anyway. So we see then that existentialism, as a separate and specific philosophical worldview, is, I think, the strongest and clearest representative of that broad picture of secularism that I said, that we talked about in our last session, where there is no eternal perspective. Man finds himself in the here and now, thrown into his existence, and all of the dread and the pessimism and the despair that flows out of it. That attitude can absolutely quench the human spirit. Your children have been bathed in it. It permeates the textbook and the arts. And we need to understand it and the Christian answer to it if we're going to sing the Lord's song in an existential world.
That it
No.
for the movie?
All right. A lot of stuff in there, don't you think?
Yeah.
I took a couple of notes, and when I'm trying to think who it was, well, it was basically the group of Sartre and Camus and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche said something to this effect when they looked at what happened during the world wars. And they said, this is what man is capable of. Is that how do we look at something like that biblically? How do we look at that statement biblically? What truth is there in that statement?
I think
I
it's
would say
absolutely
that
true. Go ahead, John.
I would say that Auschwitz wasn't the problem as much as a symptom of the problem. I say that as a Calvinist. The problem was always there. What happened was it was just so in your face.
Well, okay, but how would we respond to it? You know, as a Calvinist or a biblically based person, what is this saying? What does this say about mankind? If this is what man is capable of, then what does that prove from a biblical perspective?
Well, that's the tea and tulip, isn't it?
That's right. Totally depraved.
Also consistent with their with the theology that they were espousing, that the nihilism that they were espousing, that if this, if there is nothing else, that this is all there is. And Scripture says that with is it man? Was it before the flood that man does what is right in his own eyes? And with, you know, and that's exactly what Adolf Hitler and all of his, you know, cronies and so forth. But it's not just him. I mean, we hold, everybody would say universally Adolf Hitler was a bad guy. Okay, well, you know, he couldn't have done it by himself. He had a whole lot of people who supported him to do what he did. But for them to say, so this is what was an interesting contrast to that, or contrasting how the worldview and R.C. Sproul touched on this, is that the nihilists would say despairingly, this is what man is capable of. But the more modern, you know, he touched on this with the beatniks and so forth, the more modern evolution of the existentialists or existential philosophy would be, well, that's what man's capable of, but man is basically good. Well, I don't know where they get this man is basically good business, because there's no foundation for that anyway. But
Yeah, I think what I was looking at there was the idea that even though they were coming from, as RC said, an atheistic perspective, they were really speaking some truth there. And as we, you know, because we can look around the world, we can see what's going on, and we can say, wow, this is what man is capable of when left to himself. When left to himself. And the only thing that keeps things from being worse is the fact that God has restrained it.
I'm reminded of the book Lord of the Flies. You saw the two movies. They're both disturbing in their own right. The first one probably more so than the second one, but at any rate, they're both disturbing. The book is even more so if you've read it. But again, man left to his own devices, you know, without God. The question I would have for existentialists is, if we came from nothing and we're going to nothing and there's no purpose, then what has been holding society together all these millennia? It doesn't make sense. It's completely non sequitur and illogical to say that there is no purpose in life if we have society at all. We didn't fabricate our values out of nothing, because if we did, then we would be like Lord of the Flies, or we would be like Nazi Germany and the concentration camps. Ultimately, that's the only place where we would go.
Well, then if we look at the question that's up there right now, then what is it about existentialism that appeals to modern man? You know, I mean, they were talking 150 years ago, but as RC said, it has become probably the most of all the isms, the one that permeates us the most even today. What do you think appeals to modern man about it?
Well, you have the advantage of creating your own truth and without having to defend it and letting somebody else have his own truth. But somehow the people that I know who do that don't go through the despair and the angst and the nothingness of the existentialists. And I'm wondering, is there any way to push such a person towards that despair? Say, look, this is really where this ends up.
Yeah, any thoughts on that, Weldon?
I would agree with you, John. And the question, probably Dennis has an answer to that question, but to answer the question that's on the screen here, summarized in one word: accountability.
Or the lack of.
People don't want to be accountable. Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And so if I'm not accountable to anybody, then therefore I can do whatever I want, and that's okay.
Well, you know, the scripture tells us that we are supposed to do things out of the best interest of others. I think RC emphasized that when he said, it's about me, it's not about we. And I think that that's part of this problem. And it's easier for us to look at ourselves and try to, and be where we are ourselves rather than it is to look at others and try to put others ahead of ourselves. And I think that that's, because what is sin, what is the real essence of what sin is? What's it really boiled down to?
It's being your own God.
Yeah, and that rears its head because we're basically selfish. Okay, because if we want to be our own God, that's because we want things the way we want them to be. So if we really think of it, the bottom line is Adam and Eve were being selfish. When the fall happened, they were being selfish. They wanted their own deal. And so that nature has stayed obviously with man throughout all of history. And so existentialism feeds to that, because existentialism, even though it has the despair and the angst and the nothingness and all that, it still boils down to it saying to the individual, you're the one.
Well, I would go back a little bit further as well. So a very prime example of existentialism and the concept of there is no God, not even Nietzsche saying God is dead, but that there is no God at all, is the French Revolution. You can go and look through all the history of that. I mean, that is a prime example of existentialism. But I would argue that it has been with us ever since Genesis 3 at the end of the day. And it was probably more articulated in the 19th century, as R.C. Sproul said, but I think it's the concept and the spirit has always been with us.
Yeah.
And best possibly summarized by, and there's no king in Israel, everyone did what was right in his own eyes.
Correct.
All right, let me try it this way. Okay, and sometimes I'll put these up because these are discussion questions that come out of the study, and we might have already answered it. So if you think that's the case, just say so, or if you think you have a good answer for this, that's fine too. But what aspects of our culture have provided fertile ground for the growth of existentialism?
The Department of Education.
Okay. That would be one. What else?
What specifically are you thinking of?
A federal indoctrination of children.
Hmm.
The day, it is not what it was, what people espoused it to be and reported it to be.
What other cultural things did RC talk about that gave fertile ground to the growth of existentialism? Particularly, what did he say was about the men that he cited here, Camus, Sartre, and those folks? What were they able to do that provided fertile ground?
Well, they had a credibility. Well, Sartre and Camus did by resisting the Nazis.
Yeah.
So they were heroes.
But their platform, though, to build on that concept, their platform was entertainment at the end of the day, right?
Yes.
Playwrights, or well, Sartre, was it Sartre? Which one was a playwright? You mentioned. They had platforms for public.
I think both Sartre and Camus.
They were both writers and
Yeah.
playwrights. fact, I remember in school reading reading a play about Sartre. He also did a movie which we studied in college.
It's very interesting, even with the, Hollywood and, you can say Cannes in France or whatever, but the movies that are produced or largely historically have been produced in the US, like R.C. Sproul pointed out, have always had a happy ending in some way. That there may be tragic events throughout the movie, they've always had a happy ending. And I think
Right.
that's been, even with very, very secular movies, they've all, they typically have had a happy ending. Whereas if you look at movies that have been made in continental Europe and, in France and Germany in particular, they very often have a very unhappy ending. And I think that that's, a testament to American optimism and
Yeah.
our Judeo-Christian heritage there.
What do you think about that? Why were the Europeans more apt, say in the 30s, 40s, even into the 50s, more apt to see a despair type of existence?
Were they more honest?
No, I don't think that's it. Personally, I don't think that's it. I think it's because they looked around and they saw what had happened to their countries. They saw the devastation. So they bought into what these guys were saying about this is what man is capable of. So the existential thing and understanding, I'm desperate in my life, or I have this angst, and it wasn't just the typical angst of am I going to get a bill paid? It was an angst for living. And I think that I think that in the United States we didn't see that. The only place that we saw that in the United States was at Pearl Harbor. And so it wasn't like people walked the streets in the United States and said, oh, this is so awful, this is so awful. So there was an optimism as expressed post World War II. There was an optimism in the United States that didn't really give way to anything until the Beat generation, so to speak. But a lot of that out of the Beat generation came from Europe.
So what we need is about 8 years of Biden till we catch up with the Europeans.
Oh, I knew we'd get something political in here.
That's all I wanted to say about him.
Okay, all right. Okay, and what are the symptoms of a culture infected with existentialism? And I think these are some of the things that he was talking about. But I think if we take this definition and think about it, he talked about the existence precedes essence. Existence precedes essence. And, it's almost like, I think what was being said is that existentialism pretty much ignores essence. Does that sound fair?
Well, you have to create your own essence, do you not? Jump into be the existential hero, and be an essential person as opposed to all these other run-of-the-mill unworthy clods. What Sartre would say, the salaud, which is everybody else who don't have the guts to create their own essence.
Yeah. One of the things that's mentioned here is that the individual counts, not the group. And so when we see the culture, saying that the individual has all the rights, for example. You know, any individual in our culture today that has any kind of an issue with what is the norm, unless of course they're conservative, but if they're, even, I wouldn't count a lot of the people that are subscribing to this type of philosophy that they're necessarily liberal. They just don't know any better. I think that the liberals are out there, and those that are liberals, we know who they are. But the run-of-the-mill person that you run into at the grocery store, like I ran into a guy at the gas station a few weeks ago, and it was right after Biden was elected, and I said something. It was when gas prices started going up, and I said something to the effect of, "Yeah, well, I guess gas prices are starting to go up." And the guy said, "Yeah," and then he started ripping on Trump. And I said to him, you know, I asked him, I said, "Well, you know, as you fill up your truck with gas, it's because of Biden. And because Biden is going to do away with a lot of the things that Trump did." And of course, as soon as I said that, the guy said, "I'm not going to argue." So I just said to him, I said, "Look," I said, "just because we have a discussion doesn't mean we're arguing." And I said, "But just think about it. When you fill up your truck and you're paying $3 for a gallon of gas instead of $2, who are you going to blame?" And then I went on and said, "What about your investments? When your investments are down by 20% in a few months, who are you going to blame for that?" And it's like he had no idea of how that, you know, he wasn't necessarily an out and out liberal. He just didn't know any better. And I think that goes both ways. I think there's people that are on the right that don't know any better. They're just doing it because they want to be on the right, and they haven't really done the ideological pieces to it. It's just, hey, you know, let's do this. And I think the people that are real thoughtful are the ones that are getting trampled down. So anyway,
Fair. And I think it's interesting too that you would call that out, and regardless of political persuasions or whatever, but existentialism would be all about the individual and what the individual wants or what he thinks is right or what have you. But then it's very interesting that in today's society, and it's obviously inconsistent, and you could extend that to Arminianism. Modern Arminianism is inconsistent with traditional, but modern existentialism is inconsistent with, you know, Sartre or with, you know, Nietzsche or whatever. But people would say that, you know, it's all about the individual, but then they want to blame somebody. Well, no, if it's about the individual, then you're responsible too, right? But you can't have that discussion because then you're arguing with the guy at the gas pump, right?
Right. Yeah. So now these are some of the claims of existentialism, and how do we answer these from a Christian perspective? How do we answer the claim of individuality?
Go ahead.
Go
Want to
ahead.
dominate?
Go ahead. Go ahead, Weldon.
Oh. Well, I mean, so I think that this is very important to understand from a Christian perspective and a Judeo-Christian heritage. And he mentioned specifically Buddhism, which would hold that people live in this earth and you know, during their lives or whatever. When they die, they kind of fade away into the vast ocean of humanity or whatever. It's they're like a drop, whatever. But for the Christian, the individual is who Christ died to save, who Christ was resurrected to save, and to be a brother with Christ under God. So the individual is extremely important, but society is comprised of multiple individuals and not just a single individual. If you were an individual living by yourself on an island unto yourself, then obviously you would have fewer obligations. So I guess that's my 2 cents on
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. My take on it is what I'll go back to what I said earlier about the individual as opposed to the group. We're supposed to be putting not our individuality out there, but our sharing of burdens of others, that we're supposed to put other people's interests ahead of ourselves. So I think that's how I would answer it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't disagree.
And this guy who's all hep on creating his own essence, as opposed to all these other, to use Sartre's term, salaud out there who aren't doing the same, thinking himself better than others. Well, what good is that? You're only helping yourself. You're only building up your own essence. What good does that do somebody else?
Right, right. It's the individual. Now, what about experience? What do we hear about experience from the existentialists?
Yes, the experience of being hurled into the, I can't read my own handwriting, into this universe, and you have to carve out your own existence.
Yeah,
We had an experience when God kicked our ancestor Adam out of the garden. That would be hurling out into the world apart from the garden because of our sin. I don't know how the existentialist would understand, okay, why were we hurled out like this?
well, they wouldn't understand it anyway because of the implication that had for all of the human race, because they're looking for individual experiences, even though it was individuals that was happening to, it had ramifications for all of mankind.
Yes, but why? They say it happened. We know why. What is their answer?
Well, I don't think they're not thinking in terms of being hurled out of the Garden of Eden.
No, of course not. But okay, but why to them were we hurled out? From where?
Well, I don't know that they would even consider that.
It's just their angst. That's what they're feeling.
Yeah, yeah. And see, that's because they come from nothingness and they go to nothingness.
But if you're hurled out, you have to be hurled out from something.
But see, they would say there's nothing at the beginning, there's nothing at the end.
Okay.
And of course, they're not going to be able to, what you're saying, they probably wouldn't even think about what was I hurled out from, because they're talking about being hurled into something. And I don't think they have any concept of where they might have come from, because of their position on what they say about nothing and nothingness.
Well, John, I think your point was illustrated by R.C. Sproul there, where he was talking about the ladder to heaven was no longer there.
Yes,
So that, I mean, you know, so the ladder was no longer the ladder to where, you know, if you're going to say the ladder was no longer there, or
Yeah.
Nietzsche, that God is dead. Well, that assumes that therefore God was at one time alive, right? But he doesn't want to talk about that. I
Right.
think also what's interesting too, from an experiential perspective, is the how existentialism has blended nihilism and Epicureanism together, because people obviously they want to do what they want to do that brings them pleasure or joy. You know, sometimes at the expense of others, mostly to the expense of others. But then if there's nothing to begin with and to end with, then, you know, eat, drink, and be merry, right? So.
Yeah, we'll be looking at hedonism later on too. That's one of the things we'll be looking at. One-dimensional man. If that's the case, that man is one-dimensional, according to the existentialists, how do we combat that as we would be talking to them about that?
well, there's an awful lot of artwork that was created before the ladder was taken up by people who had a very different view. And the people in this art and what they represent are anything but one-dimensional. So my question is, well, were these artists, were they cuckoo? Were they depicting a reality that simply isn't there?
I think that's very interesting that you would bring that up, John. You would think about like some of the very fascinating art that, and we tend to think in terms of Western European, you know, that's our background, our heritage, and so forth. But you know, well, what about Egyptian art, or we look at Mayan art, for example, or even parts of Asia and India and so forth. There's all this non-Christian inspired art that predates us by millennia, right?
Yeah.
That can be very, very fascinating to look at. And some of the themes from the religions that those spawn from is also very important to understand, because I think that there's probably a thread of truth in many of them. And if you really peel back the onion, you can kind of study them and the existence of the monotheistic Judeo-Christian God that we, the one true God, throughout all of that, and that had been corrupted through time, or the concept that had been corrupted through time. So I think that's interesting you would bring that up about the before the ladder was taken up.
For some of our Western musical tradition, Beethoven, Mozart,
Absolutely.
How can man be one dimension? I mean, those compositions, even the ones without lyrics to chew on, don't they scream at you? Man is not one dimensional.
Yeah, I agree with that, John. There's just the fact that we think, that we create, that we do things. I just had this. I had cataract surgery, and I was just absolutely amazed at the process and how I went in, and they had these various machines that they used to measure my eyes, to measure the cataracts, even some that went in and measured the wall of my inner eye, so that they would know whether or not they needed to be careful about something. So all that, and then going in and having the procedure done, and thinking about all that was going on there. And I asked the doctor a few things about what was going on, but how they figured out and knew they needed to use water to keep your eye not open, but keep your eyeball round, because as they did the work, it could have collapsed. And so, they knew that. And then the doctor himself being able to have that expertise to be able to take that scalpel that he used, make such a tiny incision, suck out the old lens, put the new lens in so that it unfolded. I mean, it's just incredible when I think about this. And, when you think about all that, how can man be one dimensional?
Yeah.
I mean, it just is, it was absolutely, and I had it done to both eyes, so I got to see it. But, and the second time that they did it, I was able to sort of see more things because I wasn't as nervous. I wasn't as, apprehensive about things. So I was able to kind of see some things like the edge of the lens when they were putting it in and things. And so, I mean, if you just look around, you can see that man is not one dimensional. Here's the one. Oh, go ahead.
How do we get from Kitty Hawk in 1903 to landing on the moon in 1967?
Right.
It's I've given a lot of thought to the fact that if you're going to repress the truth about God, you're going to repress the implications of a lot of truth that you see with your own eyes. And John Adams said facts are stubborn things, and they are stubborn whether you acknowledge the facts or not. And these things that we've, art, music, killing cataracts, flight, these things, they're just incredible.
Yeah.
How none of this would be possible if there weren't a well-defined order in the world, that there's some principles that man has been able to latch on to and be very creative with them.
Yeah.
It's not this whole meaninglessness stuff.
What about the
Meaningless, where would there be any ambition to accomplish anything or to achieve anything? Where
Right.
our heart for service to others,
Yeah.
whether you're atheistic or not, if you're in the medical field, you have a heart for serving others. It doesn't matter, you may be the most disagreeable doctor in the world, but you have talent and a skill and a desire to do something.
Right.
What gives you that drive?
Yeah. Why would the Wright brothers have this ambition? I mean, they flew out, they traveled all the way down to North Carolina, but why Kitty Hawk? Because they could always count on a good, steady wind. That's why they went to Kitty Hawk. They didn't have that kind of conditions in Dayton. They did the research. Where in this country should we go? And they took a long trip over something that they knew might not even work.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, conversely, look at Lewis and Clark. They went where they knew absolutely nothing, right? What was their desire but to explore the world that God had given us and understand it more?
They wouldn't have made good existentialists.
No, I don't think they would.
So I
Well,
think,
what can you say, Wilbur and Orville, those preachers' kids, what do they know, right?
I think we've probably answered the nothingness issue because, that's how we would respond to the fact that, here's all these things that have happened. You can't tell me there's nothing to life. you know. There's a couple more here. Despair. Well, you know, if they don't have Christ, they are going to be in despair. And that's why we need to be sharing the gospel with folks because, you know, if we had our funeral for RB today, how much despair would there have been if there was no hope for him? And unfortunately, that's the problem with a lot of people. You know, every time I see some celebrity die, people post RIP. Well, you know what?
Yeah,
If they're believers, then they're resting in peace. If they're not resting in peace.
right.
But because people don't understand this despair, this idea, then they live in a world that they have to say rest in peace because they don't know any better.
Yeah. Well,
What are they resting in?
Ecclesiastes talks about angst, talks about vanity, and he is a guy who made all these projects, which presuppose the very kind of orderliness that we're talking about. So it's possible to be fully aware that we're living in a world that's of order, and yet still have angst.
Yeah.
If you're working within the order without realizing the emptiness of everything compared to eternity, and if you're putting all your eggs in the basket of this world, then your life is vanity. So that's a different kind of angst.
Well, you know, I see a lot of the folks that are Christians. I know they've made a profession of faith, and yet they're showing anxiety over a lot of things.
Mhm.
And, you know, we need to rest in the fact that God has put us in a particular situation. We are in this situation. And I honestly almost think it's a sin when we complain about what goes on in the world because we're questioning God's providence. And and unfortunately, I see that in too many people, whether they're upset about the presidency or they're upset about something that happened in their lives. I understand you've got to deal with those things, but you have to deal with it from the perspective that I know that my Savior lives. And I know because of that, that the best thing, you know, I think to live as Christ, to die as gain.
Yes. Yeah. You know, one thing that really helped me recently was to think of the two disciples on the way to Emmaus.
Mm,
And they were really disappointed because they thought that this Jesus of Nazareth was going to do, to use our language, he was going to drain the swamp.
yeah.
And look what happened. The swamp got him. And then they
It
weren't
is.
expecting him to rise from the dead. But then the disciples, they're on the last question they asked him before he went up to heaven. Are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? Lord, are you going to drain the swamp now? And he said, no.
That's what a lot of folks wanted.
Yeah. But then what did they do? When he ascended to heaven, I mean, that was I can't help but think that was the time when their hope that Jesus would drain the swamp was totally dashed to pieces. So what did they do? That must have been a disappointment. It doesn't tell us how they dealt with the disappointment, but it does tell them what they did do. They worshiped him. They returned to Jerusalem, which was the capital of the swamp, and they were continually in the temple praising and blessing God. They went right back to the swamp, the very swamp they knew he told them was going to get them to. So the challenge to the Christian who's bummed out because the swamp wasn't drained is, okay, don't let these clowns rob you of your joy in Jesus Christ. And I know that's a lot more easily said than done.
Yeah.
But that's the challenge before us, and that's what we have to tell our brethren, exhort them, and when we slip and fall, they'll pick us up, say, Taylor, don't let that happen. Don't let anyone rob you of your joy in Jesus. Now, does that mean we don't do anything about it? No, we do whatever we can to try to maintain what our fathers gave to us with a lot of blood and treasure. Because I don't want to explain to them why my generation blew it, but I will if I have to.
Yeah. And then the final thing is autonomy, which I think obviously, I think the answer to that is that no man is an island. You know, we all have connections of some kind, and we can't deny that. And we can't live our lives in a way that says that we are autonomous from anything and anybody.
Yeah.
All right, now,
Well, I have a question.
okay,
Cindy and I have been praying for years, especially Cindy. There's a woman in California who is, her big thing is, I have my truth and you have your truth. She is self-authenticating this way, and she had to talk about freedom. Yeah, she's free to worship her goddess as she sees it, as she sees her, and we are free to worship our God as we see him, kind of a thing. Is there any way to try and push her towards the despair that the existentialists, is she doing an end run around the despair if she's going to concoct her own truth, be her own person, or is that a rabbit trail we shouldn't even look for?
well, I don't know that I would throw her into the existentialist movement necessarily. There are several others that we're going to be looking at, John, that might have a better answer to that.
Okay.
And I think when we get to the end, then that's something to take a look at and say, okay, this is where she is. She could be a humanist, for example, which is what we're going to be looking at next week. She could
Okay.
be a pragmatist. So we're going to look at all those.
Okay.
So that might, so it might be that existentialism doesn't fit her, but
Gotcha.
it might be that we need to see a few weeks before we actually come to that conclusion.
Okay. So that's not the pebble to try to put in her shoe then? Probably not.
I would, well, I don't know. I'm saying that as you look at some other of the philosophies that are out there that we're going to take a look at, there might be a better fit. That's all I'm saying.
Okay.
Okay.
Stay
All right.
tuned.
I have about 4 questions that are very easily answered. As a formal movement, existentialism began in what century?
18.
The Garden of Eden.
Sorry?
The Garden of Eden
Now, as a formal movement.
as a formal movement. Okay. 19th.
And there it is. The magic arrow gives us the answer.
The what?
The magic arrow.
Magic arrow.
Yeah. Hold on. See the. All right. So when you give the answer, the magic arrow flies in. You see it?
Oh, no, I don't. I almost, let me see the other dots.
You worked so hard for those arrows, Dennis.
Are they not showing up on your
I
stuff?
can see it, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I do have to work hard. That's the hardest part of doing a thing. Modern art and film have been major mediums to communicate the ideas of existentialism. Is that true or false?
It's an easy one.
Yeah.
True.
And we'll actually be looking at art and literature at the end of the sessions. Those are the last 2 weeks.
Ah,
Existentialism emphasizes metaphysics.
nope.
And that one is false. Whoop. Let me go back. You didn't see that. Existentialism is a movement from rationality to irrationality, irrationality to rationality, emotionality to logic, and subjective experience to the empirical. Got the answer?
That one, I know the answer is number one, but but I think about that in Genesis 1 that God brought order out of chaos, and that existentialism therefore must be the opposite of that in every way.
Yes. Yep.
Yeah.
So I think we can shut that down. There we go. And can I ask you, John, if you'd be kind enough to close us out with prayer?
Sure. Lord and our God, we thank you that in your sovereignty, you have not caught us in this web, of this trap of despair, which is a heavy price that a lot of people have paid for denying you. Lord, I think of Sartre and Camus. I've read some of their works, and I've admired them and I respected them. And yet the answer was always there, right in front of them. And they refused to accept it. They refused to seek you, Lord, and have led a lot of people astray. Lord, we pray that as we think about these things, that we would better understand our fellow men, those to whom we would present the gospel. Lord, we pray that you would enlarge our hearts and our minds as creatures of truth, to not only better perceive the error of existentialism, but also to be able to explain it to those in a convincing way to show that we really understand it, and can be of help as we come alongside of people who are lost. So we pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Hey, thanks for a good discussion.
You bet.
Weldon, appreciate your input.
Yes, sir. Y'all have a good night.
Good.
And I guess I'll see you tomorrow night on the Christian Ed meeting.
Yes, probably so.
All right. Okay.
We take off tomorrow for Yankee Land.
Hey, have a safe trip.
Thanks.
And watch the snow.
Yeah,
'Cause
we'll
you're gonna hit it.
Early.
we'll be leaving early. 6.5
Okay.
hours to
Columbus.
Columbus for our first leg.
Yeah. Well, have a safe trip. I've made that Columbus trip. It's that West Virginia Turnpike can be pretty treacherous.
Yeah, yeah.
I
There's
actually,
a lot of ice up there today, so.
John, when I was working with FCA in Pittsburgh, I was working 2 weeks a month up in Pittsburgh and driving back and forth. And I was coming down 19 into Beckley, and there's a town called Oak Hill. And when I hit Oak Hill, they got 24 inches of snow in about 2 hours. And I wound up spending the night in the Oak Hill High School cafeteria.
Huh.
The trooper came up to my car when I finally, 2.5 hours passed, and I got about a mile and a half during that time. Trooper or the sheriff come up to the car and said, you got 2 options. You can pull over there and stay in your car all night, or you can pull over there and I'll take you up to the school. And they were only letting 4-wheel drive vehicles go through.
Mm.
So anyway, just be safe.
Thank you.
All right, I'll see you tomorrow, Weldon.
Yes, sir. Take care.
Take care.